Snow fell in thick, wind-whipped curtains over Walnut Street, muffling the vibrant pulse of Philadelphia into a deep, resonant quiet. Just before midnight, a piercing shriek sliced through the storm's drone. It was a single, desperate cry, almost immediately consumed by the gale. A small girl stumbled from a brownstone into the street, her thin coat torn, exposing her knees to the biting cold. From behind her, a woman's voice cut like glass. "Get out! You're nothing but a problem." A heavy door slammed shut, sealing her fate in the disorienting swirl of the blizzard. If this image seizes your attention, hold on to it. The events that unfold next will challenge every notion of compassion, justice, and the profound meaning of taking a stand when everyone else is looking away. Think for a moment what you would do, seeing a child abandoned in a tempest. Because on this night, one man did stop, and that single act altered the course of several lives. Her name was Zoe, all of 6 years old. A fragile composition of sharp angles and faint bruises. She stood shoeless on the frozen marble steps of an elegant townhouse near Rittenhouse Square, her small hands clutching a threadbare stuffed bear, whose stuffing was beginning to escape its seams. Each exhale was a painful, visible cloud in the frigid air. The ornate street lamps cast a hazy, shimmering glow through the driving snow, making the world seem surreal, as if the city itself had averted its gaze. At the corner, a sleek black sedan was idling, its powerful headlights carving tunnels through the storm. Inside sat Marcus Thorne, a man whose name graced corporate towers and financial journals, but who hadn't genuinely smiled since the day he laid his wife and daughter to rest. He was departing a late-night board meeting at Thorne Enterprises when he saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the blizzard, but the impossible sight of a child standing barefoot in the middle of it. He pushed open his car door, his overcoat whipping violently in the wind. "Hey," he called out, his voice nearly stolen by the storm. The little girl flinched, retreating instinctively toward the steps. "It's all right," he said, softening his tone, making it gentle, careful. "Are you lost?" She shook her head, her teeth chattering so hard it was audible over the wind. "She locked me out," Zoe whispered. The words barely formed. "Said I don't belong here." A knot tightened in Marcus's chest. He had witnessed cruelty in his life, in the ruthless arenas of business and power plays, but never this raw, this personal. "Where are your parents?" he asked. "My daddy's away," she said, hugging the worn bear even tighter. "She's my stepmom." A silhouette shifted behind the frosted glass of the front window, a woman's form, watching for a moment before melting back into the darkness. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers stiff and numb from the cold. "I'm calling for help," he said. "You're not spending another minute out here." The girl's eyes widened with fear. "No," she pleaded. "The police just make it worse." Marcus paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Then, with resolve, he shrugged off his expensive coat and wrapped its warmth around her trembling body. "Tonight," he said in a low voice, "I'm willing to take that chance." When the police cruiser arrived, its flashing red and blue lights painted the falling snow in vivid, urgent colors. The stepmother, Brenda Vance, answered the door with a practiced saccharine sweetness that felt brittle and false. "Officer, this is a terrible misunderstanding," she purred. Zoe threw a tantrum and ran outside. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding. "I watched her force the child into the snow," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. That wasn't a tantrum. It was abuse. The two officers exchanged a meaningful glance. Brenda's manufactured smile began to crumble. One of the officers knelt down to Zoe's level. "Honey, is there somewhere safe you can go tonight?" The little girl just shook her head, her gaze fixed on the ground. Marcus's hand moved almost of its own accord. "She has one now," he said firmly. The officer looked from the powerful man to the shivering child and nodded slowly. "We'll file a report. CPS will be in touch tomorrow. For tonight, she's in your care, Mr. Thorne." Brenda's face contorted, raw fury finally breaking through her charming facade. "You think your money makes you some kind of hero?" she spat. "You have no idea what that child is like." Marcus turned to face her, his voice low and cold as the ice on the pavement. "I don't need to. I just know she's freezing." With that, he gently lifted Zoe into his arms and walked back toward his car, disappearing into the swirling snow. Inside the sedan, the heater hummed, and the city lights streaked past the windows in a blurry watercolor. Zoe stared at her own reflection, a tiny, ghost-like figure enveloped in a stranger's massive coat. "You're not mad at me?" she asked, her voice small. "No," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But I am angry, just not at you." She blinked, processing his words. "You sound like my daddy." "Where is he?" Marcus asked gently. "Far away," she whispered. The journey to Marcus's residence on Delancey Place felt both brief and eternal. Philadelphia was asleep under its thick white blanket, every street silenced and still. Within the car, time seemed to hang suspended in the space between profound fear and a fragile, emerging hope. As they approached his home, grand iron gates swung open, revealing a house that felt more like a historical landmark than a place where someone lived. Marcus carried her over the threshold. The marble floors gleamed, and the air was heavy with a profound silence. Mrs. Evelyn, his housekeeper of many years, appeared in her dressing gown, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, taking in the scene of her employer, holding a small, disheveled child. "Get a blanket, please," Marcus instructed her, "and some hot chocolate, a lot of it." Zoe clung to his sleeve as Mrs. Evelyn enveloped her in a soft, warm throw. For a fleeting moment, she looked less like a survivor and more like a child. Marcus knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Just for tonight, understand?" She nodded, her eyelids heavy with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "You're not like her," she murmured. "You didn't look away." He nearly confessed that he knew exactly how it felt to be unseen, but he caught himself. Instead, he simply tucked the blanket more snugly around her. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside the grand house, a quiet life was beginning to stir again. That night, as Zoe slept on the sofa near the fireplace, Marcus remained awake in the armchair opposite her. The dancing flames mirrored in his weary eyes. He couldn't quite grasp why this specific child, on this specific night, had managed to breach the fortress he had built around his heart. Perhaps it was the way she still clutched that tattered bear, as if believing that love, once torn, could somehow be mended. Or perhaps it was because for the first time in a very long time, he had made the conscious choice to care. He whispered into the stillness of the room, "You won't have to face another storm alone." And somewhere beyond the snow and the distant sirens, a new story was taking shape, one that would ultimately test the lengths a man would go to honor a promise made on a frozen Philadelphia night. By morning, the storm had exhausted itself, leaving Philadelphia draped in a pristine, silent blanket of white. The streets outside Marcus Thorne's townhouse were transformed, the familiar landscape buried beneath the night's relentless fury. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but filled with a tentative uncertainty. Zoe, swaddled in one of Marcus's cashmere blankets, sat on the edge of a couch that dwarfed her small frame, clutching her stuffed bear as if it were her last connection to a world she understood. Her bare feet dangled inches above the Persian rug, swinging in a nervous rhythm as her gaze shifted from the crackling fire to the tall, quiet man across the room. Marcus had spent the night in the armchair, drifting in and out of a shallow sleep, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on his face. He was unaccustomed to having another person in his home, especially a child, but some deep-seated instinct wouldn't allow him to leave her side. Each time she stirred or whimpered in her sleep, he found himself instantly alert, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, just to be certain she was still there. When Mrs. Evelyn entered at dawn, her soft slippers whispering against the floorboards, she stopped short at the scene. "You were up all night," she observed quietly. Marcus simply nodded, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "It didn't feel right to sleep," she observed, the little girl for a long contemplative moment before whispering, "In that case, I'll make breakfast for two." Zoe watched her vanish into the kitchen, her eyes filled with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "Is she nice?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Marcus turned to her. "Mrs. Evelyn? She's the kindest person I know." He attempted a smile, but it felt foreign on his face, a faint, unpracticed curve of his lips. A few minutes later, the comforting aroma of coffee and pancakes filled the room. Mrs. Evelyn returned bearing a tray, which she placed on the low table before Zoe. Go on and eat, sweetheart, she said, with a gentle warmth. You must be famished. Zoe hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Marcus as if seeking permission. It's okay, he said softly. Go ahead. She took a single, tentative bite, then another, this time more quickly, her small shoulders gradually relaxing with each mouthful. Mrs. Evelyn watched her with a quiet, profound understanding. There's no need to rush, she murmured. There's plenty more. It was a simple meal, but for Zoe, it was a banquet. When she finally looked up, a hint of color had returned to her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Evelyn's smile was genuine as she brushed a stray curl from the girl's forehead. You are very welcome, baby. The knock on the front door came mid-morning. It was firm, professional, and carried an unmistakable air of authority. Marcus rose immediately, a familiar tension tightening in his chest. When he opened the door, a woman stood in the grand entryway, bundled in a practical wool coat, a badge glinting on her lapel. Mr. Thorne? She inquired. Sharon Miles, Child Protective Services. Her voice was calm, but held an undeniable weight. Marcus stepped back to let her in. Ms. Miles's gaze swept the room, professionally assessing the environment before settling on the small figure curled on the couch. Her expression softened instantly. You must be Zoe, she said gently. Hello there. Zoe shrank back into the blanket, her grip on the bear tightening. Ms. Miles crouched down to meet her at eye level. You're safe, okay? I'm just here to make sure you're all right. Marcus watched in silence as the social worker carefully examined the faint bruises on the child's wrists and the fading marks on her arm. Each mark was a chapter in a story Zoe was too young to articulate. He felt his jaw clench, actively suppressing the wave of anger that rose within him. She was outside in the blizzard, he stated quietly. She was thrown out. Ms. Miles looked up at him, her expression sharp. You witnessed this? I did. She scribbled in her notepad, her face now grave. The police filed a preliminary report last night. We're opening an immediate investigation into the stepmother's conduct. She glanced again at Zoe, then back at Marcus. Given the situation, it's best for her to remain here for the time being. We'll conduct regular home visits until we can locate and contact her father. Marcus nodded, though the word temporary hung in the air like a premonition. Ms. Miles seemed to sense his thoughts. Mr. Thorne, she said gently, I realize this is not something you anticipated, but for now, the most important thing is that she feels secure. That's always the first step. After Ms. Miles had departed, a heavy quiet settled over the house again. Zoe was sitting by the large window, watching as gusts of wind blew snow from the branches of the trees. Marcus approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. Would you like me to try and call your dad? He asked. She shook her head. He's too far. Aunt Brenda said he doesn't like phone calls. There it was again, that quiet, heartbreaking resignation in her voice, a world weariness that didn't belong in a 6-year-old. Marcus let out a slow breath. Well, Aunt Brenda isn't the one making decisions anymore, he said firmly. You'll be staying here for now. She turned to look at him, her expression uncertain. He hesitated for a beat. For as long as it takes. Mrs. Evelyn appeared at his side, carrying a neatly folded pair of pajamas. These belong to my granddaughter, she said. They should be about the right size. Zoe's fingers traced the soft flannel fabric as if it were spun from gold. Thank you, she whispered again, the words barely carrying across the room. It's all right, honey, Mrs. Evelyn said softly. You're safe with us. That afternoon, the ambient warmth of the house seemed to finally penetrate Zoe's defenses. She cautiously explored the perimeter of the living room, touching the piano keys one by one, a look of surprise on her face with each new sound. Marcus observed her from his armchair, a faint smile touching his lips. Do you play? He asked. She shook her head. My daddy used to, before. Her voice trailed off into silence. He stood and went to sit on the bench beside her. Go on, he encouraged. Try one. She pressed a key again, the single note hanging in the quiet room. Then another. The melody was faltering and fragmented, but it was a start. That's not bad, Marcus said. You have a good ear. For the first time, she looked directly at him without a trace of fear. Do you miss your family? She asked unexpectedly. The question caught him completely off guard. Yes, he admitted after a long pause. I do. every single day. She nodded with a solemn understanding. Me too. Evening descended early, the sky fading to a soft, bruised purple, and the city outside seemed to vanish behind a veil of frost on the windows. Mrs. Evelyn made more hot chocolate, and Zoe curled up on the couch with her bear and a blanket, her eyelids drooping as the warmth enveloped her small body. Marcus sat nearby, the firelight reflecting off the glass behind him. When Zoe finally drifted off to sleep, Mrs. Evelyn whispered, "That child hasn't felt safe in a very long time." Marcus nodded slowly. "Neither have I." As the fire crackled, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the child sleeping under his roof. A child who had blown into his life like a winter storm, and yet, paradoxically, had brought a strange and profound calm in her wake. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the crushing loneliness of the vast, echoing house. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, the official reports, the hearings, the endless questions, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. That little girl was never going back out into the cold. By the end of that week, Marcus Thorne's townhouse on Delancey Place no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage. What had started as a single man's act of human decency had morphed into something else entirely, a public spectacle. News vans were parked at the end of the block, their camera lenses glinting under the pale winter sun. Headlines scrolled across Philadelphia's news feeds. Tech billionaire rescues, Blizzard girl. For the city, it was a captivating story. For Marcus, it was an invasive, unwelcome storm of a different kind. Zoe remained cocooned inside, blissfully unaware of the clamor beyond the iron gates. Mrs. Evelyn became her guardian of normalcy, keeping her occupied with coloring books, freshly baked cookies, and impromptu lessons in the kitchen. Routine is what keeps a child's world from spinning, she had told Marcus, and he had readily agreed, though he was unsure who needed the grounding more, the child or himself. He often found himself pausing by a doorway, just listening to the sound of Zoe's laughter, a soft, tentative sound that seemed to echo delicately against the marble and mahogany. It was as if she didn't fully trust the feeling of happiness yet. The world outside, however, was far from gentle. Reporters began to scrutinize his motives. Tabloid websites whispered about the reclusive, widowed magnate trying to replace his own lost daughter. The city's talk radio shows debated whether a man like Marcus Thorne, a powerful, private, and exceedingly wealthy black man, had any right to be the caretaker for a child he'd simply found on the street. People will construct the narrative they want to believe, Sharon Miles had told him during her first follow-up visit. Your only job is to be a steady presence for her. He tried, he truly did. But maintaining steadiness was a challenge when his phone buzzed incessantly with calls from lawyers, board members, and journalists, all demanding statements, clarifications, and reassurances. The last thing Marcus wanted was to make this story about himself. Yet somehow, it always seemed to circle back to him. Mrs. Evelyn watched him pacing one evening and finally interjected, "You can't defeat whispers with shouting, Mr. Thorne. You just have to keep showing them who you are through your actions." Later that week, Brenda Vance reemerged. She had been invisible since that night in the snow, but she returned now with a fresh application of lipstick, a stylish new coat, and a lawyer shadowing her every move. She appeared on Marcus's doorstep, projecting a disingenuous warmth. "I believe we've all had a chance to calm down and see this was an overreaction," she said sweetly when he opened the door. "It was all a simple misunderstanding." Her smile faltered when she saw that Marcus's expression remained unchanged. "You abandoned a child in a blizzard," he said, his voice flat and hard. "There is no misunderstanding that." Her lawyer stepped forward. "Ms. Vance is willing to cooperate fully with CPS. She would simply like to see the child." Marcus's tone was like ice, not without official clearance. Then, softer, but with deadly certainty, he added, "And you will not frighten her again." Brenda's eyes flashed, first with anger, then with cold calculation. "You think your money makes you the savior here?" she hissed. "Just wait until the world finds out what kind of man you really are." When she was gone, Marcus shut and locked the door, the echo of her threat lingering in the air like a persistent chill. He was not a naive man. He knew exactly what she would do, spin her own version of events, casting herself as the victim. The cameras would devour it. The powerful, enigmatic billionaire versus the struggling, misunderstood stepmother. It was a narrative people loved. And just as he predicted, within days, the local networks had picked up her story. They aired interviews with neighbors who claimed they never saw anything. They ran rampant speculation about Marcus's motives. Old photographs of his late wife and daughter were flashed on screen, paired with sound bites that twisted his personal tragedy into a source of public scandal. The pressure of perception was immense, and Marcus could feel the walls of his private life closing in. Sharon Miles arrived again on a gray afternoon, her demeanor brisk but not unkind. She provided updates. The investigation was proceeding, and the stepmother's history was troubling, though not yet legally conclusive. Until her father is located and returns, Ms. Miles said, you remain her court-appointed guardian under our supervision. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. And all this noise outside? He asked. Ignore it, she advised firmly. Children don't need heroes on the evening news. They need stability in their own living room. That night, Marcus walked into the living room and found Zoe at the piano again. Her small fingers pressed the keys with a gentle touch, searching for the fragments of a melody she was trying to piece together from memory. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she hummed the tune softly to herself. You're getting better, he said. She turned, surprised, then offered a faint smile. It sounds better when you play it, she replied. He sat down on the bench next to her, and together they worked their way through the notes, halting, imperfect, but honest. When they finished, Zoe looked up at him. Why are those people outside taking our picture? She asked. The innocent question struck him with more force than any camera flash ever could. Because they don't understand what's happening yet, he answered gently. But they will. She seemed satisfied with his answer for the moment and turned her attention back to the piano. In the days that followed, Marcus made a pivotal decision. If the world was going to insist on casting him in a story, he would be the one to write the ending. He contacted the director of his philanthropic foundation and ordered a major redirection of funds toward child advocacy programs and foster care support networks. Make the announcement public, he instructed, but ensure the focus remains on the children, not on me. The move shifted the headlines, at least slightly. Thorne Foundation announces major child protection initiative. Reporters still lingered, but now some of their questions had a different tenor. There was less accusation, more genuine curiosity. Why this cause, Mr. Thorne? One of them shouted as he left his office. He paused, his breath turning to mist in the cold air, because no child should have to wait for a storm to be seen. Then he walked away before they could ask another question. At home, the chaos of the outside world felt a world away. Mrs. Evelyn kept the house filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and the feeling of warmth. Zoe had taken to drawing, creating simple pictures of houses, trees, and stick figures holding hands. One evening, she proudly presented Marcus with a crayon drawing of his townhouse, with 3 figures standing in front. That's you and me and Mrs. Evelyn, she explained. It's our safe house. Marcus stared at the drawing for a long time. Safe. The word carried an immense weight. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced himself in years, something he wasn't sure he was even entitled to. But as Zoe leaned against him, yawning softly, he realized that his own feelings didn't matter. Safety wasn't about fortified walls or financial security. It was about presence. It was about keeping the promises you make, both when the world is watching and when it isn't. That night, as snow began to fall over the city once more, Marcus stood by the window, watching the streetlights cast a warm glow on the fresh white canvas. The headlines would eventually fade. The noise would die down. But the truth of what happened in this house would remain. The girl who had been cast out into the snow was sleeping peacefully in a warm bed upstairs, and the man who had once lived in a silent, empty house was finally living with purpose. Outside, Philadelphia shimmered under its winter sky, a city of appearances and second chances. Inside, on Delancey Place, a quiet promise was holding steady against the storm. When the knock came, it was early, too early for the press and too courteous for the police. Mrs. Evelyn opened the door and stood frozen for a moment. On the front steps was a man who looked as though he had traveled across the world without sleeping. His coat was rumpled, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, and clutched in his trembling hand was a single sheet of paper, a custody notice bearing the seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. "Is she here?" he asked, his voice cracking midway through the question. "My daughter, Zoe." Mrs. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She glanced back toward the grand staircase, where Marcus had already appeared, his hand resting on the polished banister. He recognized the name before it was even spoken. "You must be Mark," he said, his voice even. The man nodded, his throat working. "I got the call from Child Services this morning. They told me what Brenda did." His gaze darted past Marcus, searching the hallway as if he expected to see his daughter materialize right there. "Is she safe?" Marcus's tone was measured and calm. "She's upstairs, still asleep. She's safe." For a long moment, Mark just stood there on the threshold, his shoulders shaking with the effort of holding himself together. "Can I see her?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes studying the man before him. He saw the profound exhaustion, the crushing guilt, the unbearable weight of too many missed calls and unread letters. Finally, he stepped aside. "She'll want to see you, but go gently. She's been through more than just a snowstorm." Mark ascended the stairs with quiet, reverent steps that barely made a sound on the thick carpet. At the top of the landing, he found Zoe's door slightly ajar. Peeking inside, he saw her sitting up in bed, still in her pajamas, a picture book open in her lap. When she looked up and saw him, she went completely still. The silence in the room stretched, as fragile as spun glass. "Daddy!" Her voice was a mere whisper, full of disbelief, as if speaking the word might make him vanish. Mark's composure finally broke. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. "Yeah, it's me." He took one slow, deliberate step into the room. Zoe blinked, her mind struggling to reconcile the man in front of her with the memory she held. Then, in a single, fluid motion, she dropped the book and launched herself from the bed. He caught her in his arms, holding on so tightly he could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his own chest. "I'm so sorry," he murmured over and over into her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." When Marcus passed by the open doorway a few minutes later, he stopped. There was no reason to go inside. The scene before him said everything that needed to be said. A father reclaiming a part of himself he thought he had lost, and a little girl remembering what love was supposed to feel like. Later, downstairs in the kitchen, Mark sat across from Marcus at the large wooden table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he hadn't touched. "I was on a project in Singapore," he explained quietly. "Brenda told me Zoe was happy. She sent me pictures, texts. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I thought—" He trailed off, shaking his head in self-recrimination. "I thought she was being loved." Marcus remained silent, allowing the quiet to hold the weight of the unspoken truth. Mark looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "You saved her life." Marcus's jaw tightened. "No, I was just the one who was there. Anyone else would have done the same." Mrs. Evelyn, who was drying dishes by the sink, turned slightly. "No, Mr. Thorne," she said gently. Most people wouldn't have stopped. The days that followed were a blur of courtrooms and waiting areas. Brenda Vance arrived at the custody hearing dressed in pearls and feigned tears, her lawyer spinning a tale of hardship and misunderstanding that quickly unraveled under the stark light of the evidence. The officer's body camera footage, the official police report, the photographs of Zoe's condition, they all told a story that no amount of performance could undo. When Zoe entered the courtroom holding her father's hand, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. She didn't have to say much. When the judge asked her if she felt safe with her stepmother, her answer was quiet but clear. "No, sir." The judge nodded gravely and turned his attention back to the attorneys. Sharon Miles presented the final, comprehensive report from CPS. Her voice was steady and factual, but her words carried the moral weight of the situation. "Mr. Grace has demonstrated full and immediate cooperation with the department, and his home has been verified as a stable and appropriate environment. Given the circumstances, we recommend the immediate termination of Ms. Vance's guardianship and the restoration of full custody to Mr. Grace." Brenda's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. "You can't do this," she shouted, jumping to her feet. "She's my daughter, too." The judge's gavel struck the block once, a sharp, final sound. "She is not," he stated coldly. "And you will have no further contact with this child." Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and clean. The last of the snow had long since melted. Mark crouched down beside Zoe on the stone steps. "It's all over now," he whispered. She looked up at him, her expression still uncertain. "Are we really going home?" "Yes," he said. "But only if that's what you want." She gave a small but decisive nod. "I do." Marcus stood a few feet away, observing them quietly. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of profound peace settle over him. Mark approached him, extending a hand. "I don't know how I can ever thank you," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Marcus replied. "Just take good care of her." "I will," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. Then, after a brief pause, he added, Would you consider staying in her life? She talks about you and Mrs. Evelyn all the time. She feels safe with you." Marcus looked down at Zoe, who was now proudly showing Mrs. Evelyn a new drawing, this one brighter and more colorful than the last. "We'll always be here for her," he said. "She knows that." That evening, when they all gathered back at the townhouse for one last supper together, Zoe asked if they could play the piano again. Marcus sat beside her as she confidently pressed the first key. It was the same hesitant melody she had first picked out, but this time her hands were steady and sure. Mark stood behind them, a smile on his face seen through a film of tears. When the song was over, Zoe leaned her head against Marcus's arm. "You and Daddy can both stay," she said, her voice sleepy. "Neither of you has to go." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'll always be close by, kiddo, even when I'm not right here." Outside, the city lights reflected on the Schuylkill River like a spill of scattered stars. Inside, the sound of quiet laughter filled the house that had once known only silence. The storm had passed, but what it had left in its wake was stronger than the wind that had started it all. Marcus stepped out onto the front stoop before turning in for the night. He looked up at the Philadelphia sky and thought about promises, the ones that are kept, the ones that are broken, and the ones that are forged in moments when the world seems to stand still. Somewhere inside, Zoe was sleeping without fear for the first time in a very long time. And for Marcus Thorne, that was more than enough. When the last note from Zoe's piano performance faded and the city lights shimmered through the window, her story seemed to have reached its conclusion. But in reality, it was a beginning. A little girl, once abandoned to the freezing snow, had discovered warmth again, not just from the hearth of a stranger's home, but from the unwavering compassion that refused to turn away. Marcus Thorne, a man who had been entombed by years of grief, learned that true redemption is not found in wealth or status, but in the quiet courage to care when no one else will. And Mark, a father haunted by his absence, came to understand that love demands presence, not perfection. Their lives, once fractured by loss and fear, converged on a single winter night and were rebuilt around a shared, fundamental truth. We are all responsible for one another. Every act of kindness, no matter how seemingly small, has the power to alter the trajectory of a person's life. Marcus never set out to be a hero. He simply acted when the moment demanded it. That one decision, to step out of his warm car and into the storm, became the hinge upon which 3 lives pivoted toward healing. The blizzard that swept through Philadelphia was both literal and metaphorical. It stripped away the illusions of wealth and pride, leaving behind only what truly mattered: our shared humanity. Zoe's laughter, once buried beneath a layer of silence, began to fill the empty spaces that Marcus's grief had carved out in his home and his heart. Mrs. Evelyn's steady wisdom provided an anchor in the chaos. Mark's humility worked to rebuild the trust that had been eroded. And together, this unlikely group proved that family is not defined by bloodlines or circumstances, but by conscious choice. This story serves as a powerful reminder that while storms in life are inevitable, our indifference to the suffering of others is optional. We exist in a world where people walk past hardship every single day, convincing themselves that someone else will surely step in. But what if we chose not to wait? What if each of us decided to be the person who stops, who listens, who reaches out a hand. You don't need to be a billionaire to change a life. You simply need to notice the child in the storm, whatever form that storm may take. Apply this lesson in your own world, starting today. Look around you, at the colleague who is struggling in silence, the neighbor who feels isolated by fear, the family member you haven't called in far too long. Be the one who steps closer instead of turning away. Empathy is a powerful, contagious force. A single act of compassion can create ripples that travel farther than you will ever know. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real and true, then don't let its impact end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this message, and help us continue to create stories that remind the world of the things that still matter. Hope, courage, and the simple, profound power of doing the right thing when it seems no one else will. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling the stories that can warm hearts long after the storm has passed.